We're going to look at one of the most famous shipwrecks of all time.
Well, it is a tragedy that continues to fascinate after more than a century.
Imagine a camera, sealed shut by the crushing pressure of the deep ocean, sitting undisturbed on the floor of the North Atlantic for over a century. Inside it, photographs, real photographs, taken by someone who was there, who witnessed something the rest of the world could barely comprehend. When deep-sea explorers recovered this relic from the darkness, more than 2 miles beneath the surface, nobody was prepared for what the developed images revealed. What you are about to discover is not just a story about a shipwreck. It is a story about humanity, arrogance, courage, and the kinds of secrets that only the ocean knows how to keep. To understand why these photographs are so haunting, you first need to understand the world that created the Titanic. The early 20th century was an era of extraordinary ambition. Industrialists, engineers, and visionaries believed with absolute certainty that human ingenuity had conquered nature. Steam power had shrunk the world. Steel had redefined architecture. And now the ocean, that ancient, indifferent force that had swallowed sailors for thousands of years, was about to be tamed once and for all. On the cold, foggy morning of March 31st, 1909, construction began at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland. What rose from those docks over the following years was not simply a ship. It was a declaration. The RMS Titanic was the largest moving object ever constructed by human hands, stretching 882 feet and 9 inches from bow to stern and rising 104 feet from keel to bridge. Her construction cost over 3 million British pounds, the equivalent of more than 300 million pounds today. Every rivet, every steel plate, every gilded banister in her first-class dining rooms was a statement that mankind had finally arrived. She belonged to a trio of Olympic-class ocean liners commissioned by the White Star Line, alongside the RMS Olympic and the HMHS Britannic. All 3 ships were engineering marvels. All 3 were eventually touched by disaster, but it was the Titanic, the one draped in the most extravagant promise, that history would never forget. Newspapers called her a floating palace. Engineers called her a triumph. And somewhere, deep in the design meetings at White Star Line headquarters, executives quietly began referring to her as practically unsinkable. That word, practically, would later be conveniently dropped. Here is the part of the story that tends to get buried under the romance of it all. The Titanic was not in perfect condition when she departed Southampton on April 10, 1912. Not even close. For 10 days before her maiden voyage, a fire had been burning inside one of her coal bunkers, bunker number 10, located in the forward section of the ship. Coal bunker fires were not entirely unheard of in the steamship era. Coal can self-ignite under pressure and heat, and large quantities stored in confined spaces are particularly vulnerable. What was unusual and deeply troubling was that this fire had been burning continuously and could not be fully extinguished before the ship sailed. Investigative journalist Senna Milani spent years researching this detail and uncovered a collection of photographs that had been stored in a private attic in England. These images, taken before the Titanic's departure, revealed a striking dark streak along the starboard hull, estimated at roughly 30 feet in length. This mark, Milani argued, was the external evidence of internal heat damage caused by the sustained coal fire. More chillingly, the section of the hull bearing that streak corresponded almost precisely to where the Titanic would later strike the iceberg. A hull already thermally weakened by days of burning coal would have been more brittle, less capable of absorbing the force of collision. The fire, in other words, may have set the stage for everything that followed. The decision to sail anyway, knowing the fire was not fully extinguished, knowing the hull may have been compromised, speaks to the overwhelming pressure that White Star Line executives placed on this voyage. The financial stakes were enormous. The eyes of the world were watching. Canceling or even delaying the maiden voyage of the most celebrated ship ever built was simply not considered an option. What makes the Titanic disaster so difficult to reckon with, even more than a century later, is that it did not have to happen. The tragedy was not simply a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was the result of a chain of deliberate choices, each one made by people who believed their confidence was the same thing as competence. As the Titanic made her way across the North Atlantic, Radio operators aboard received multiple ice warnings from other vessels traveling the same waters. The French liner La Touraine sent the first alert on the evening of April 12th, reporting thick field ice directly in the Titanic's projected path. On April 13th, the eastbound steamer Rappahannock had itself suffered hull damage from sea ice and passed along that information. Then, on the morning of April 14th, the day of the disaster, at least 5 separate ice warnings came through the ship's radio room. The Coronia reported icebergs, growlers, and large fields of ice. The Dutch ship Noordam confirmed much ice in the same region. The Baltic, the America, and the Californian all sent similar warnings throughout the day and into the evening. Captain Edward John Smith, a decorated and highly experienced mariner with over 40 years at sea, received each of these warnings. He acknowledged them politely and maintained the ship's speed. The Titanic was traveling at approximately 22 knots, near her maximum, through waters that every surrounding ship had flagged as dangerous. Why? The pressure to arrive in New York ahead of schedule was immense. A record-setting crossing would generate headlines. Headlines would generate passengers. Passengers would generate profit. And so, the warnings were folded into pockets, passed along with thanks, and forgotten. At 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, lookout Frederick Fleet spotted the iceberg from the crow's nest and rang the warning bell. The crew attempted to steer around it. They were too close and moving too fast. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the hull for approximately 10 seconds. That 10 seconds was enough. Now we arrive at the discovery that changes how we see this story. Among the various artifacts and relics recovered from the debris field surrounding the Titanic wreck, one of the most extraordinary was a camera, a compact, personal-use photographic device of the kind that was beginning to enter the hands of ordinary people in the early 20th century. Recovered from the ocean floor at a depth of over 2 miles, the camera was retrieved during one of the research expeditions that have periodically visited the site since its discovery in 1985. The fact that a camera could survive such conditions might seem impossible, but saltwater deep-sea environments, while destructive in many ways, can also act as preservatives. The crushing pressure, near-freezing temperatures, and almost total absence of light create conditions in which certain materials degrade extremely slowly. Film housed inside a sealed metal casing, protected from oxygen and biological activity, can, under the right circumstances, retain its latent images for decades or longer. What the photographs revealed, once carefully developed and processed by conservators, was a window into the final hours of the Titanic that no written account had fully captured. Some images showed the deck in the early moments of crisis, passengers still dressed in their evening attire, expressions caught somewhere between confusion and the first dawning awareness of danger. Other photographs captured the lifeboats, fewer than anyone needed, being loaded with a chaotic mixture of efficiency and panic. One image, described by those who examined it as deeply unsettling, appeared to show the ocean itself beginning to overtake the lower decks, the waterline creeping upward toward where passengers stood. These were not the polished, posed photographs of official White Star Line documentation. They were real, spontaneous, terrifyingly human, in a remarkable coincidence that historians and researchers have found difficult to dismiss. A photograph exists that may show the very iceberg responsible for the disaster. Seaman W. Wood, serving as captain of the SS Etonian in April 1912, was navigating the same general stretch of the North Atlantic just days before the Titanic's fatal collision. Wood was an amateur photographer with a habit of documenting unusual sights at sea. On April 12th, he encountered an iceberg of extraordinary size, so massive, so visually striking, that he felt compelled to photograph it and record its coordinates in his ship's log. When researchers later compared those recorded coordinates with the known location of the Titanic's collision, the match was striking. Whether or not this was definitively the same iceberg cannot be confirmed beyond all doubt. Icebergs move, currents shift, and 2 days is enough time for modest drift. But the size, the general location, the timing, and the coordinates align with chilling precision. If Wood's photograph does indeed show the iceberg that sank the Titanic, then humanity has, in a quiet and almost accidental way, been sitting on a portrait of one of history's most consequential objects for over a century. When the collision occurred and the scale of the damage became apparent to Captain Smith and his senior officers, the evacuation began. What followed was one of the most preventable mass casualty events in modern maritime history. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats, with a combined capacity of approximately 1,178 people. The ship was carrying 2,209 passengers and crew. This meant that even if every lifeboat had been filled to its absolute maximum capacity and launched without incident, roughly half the people on board would have been left without rescue options. As it happened, the lifeboats were not filled to capacity. Fear that the wooden boats would buckle under full loads, combined with the general disbelief among many passengers that the ship was truly sinking, resulted in boats being lowered with far fewer occupants than they could hold. Some lifeboats were launched with fewer than 30 people aboard, against capacities of 65. The regulatory framework that allowed this to happen was a product of its time and its arrogance. British Board of Trade regulations at the time required a specific number of lifeboats based on a ship's tonnage, not its passenger capacity. The Titanic technically met those requirements, but those requirements had not been updated since 1894, long before ships of this scale had been imagined. The White Star Line had actually considered installing additional lifeboats during the design phase and chose not to, partly out of concern that cluttering the boat deck would undermine the ship's visual elegance and interfere with the experience of first-class passengers taking their morning walks. More than 1,500 people died that night. Many of them died not from drowning in the immediate chaos, but from hypothermia in water that was approximately 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to incapacitate a person within minutes and kill within roughly 15 to 30. The lifeboats, floating nearby with room to spare, largely did not return to retrieve survivors. Officers worried about being swamped, and so people died within earshot of empty seats. At approximately 2:17 in the morning of April 15th, the Titanic completed its final act. As the bow section filled with water and dragged downward, the stern lifted into the air at a steep angle, subjecting the ship's midsection to stresses it was never designed to withstand. Between the third and fourth funnels, the hull gave way. The Titanic broke in two. The bow section plunged almost vertically, falling nearly 2 miles to the ocean floor and embedding itself deeply into the sediment. The stern, briefly buoyed by trapped air, twisted and churned before following. The two sections now rest approximately 1,970 feet apart on the ocean floor, with a debris field stretching 3 to 5 miles between them. Among the scattered artifacts lying in that field, china, shoes, personal photographs, wine bottles still sealed, children's toys, was the camera, sitting in the dark, waiting. In 1985, oceanographer Robert Ballard led a joint American-French expedition that located the wreck for the first time since the sinking. Using a remotely operated vehicle called Argo, equipped with cameras and lights, the team transmitted the first images of the Titanic's resting place to a watching world. The bow was largely intact. The grand staircase was gone, consumed by biological activity over the decades, but the steel hull, the anchors, the capstans, and the reading lamps in the corridors were still recognizable. The Titanic, in the deep cold and dark, had been quietly resting and slowly dissolving for 73 years. More recently, a deep-sea mapping company called Magellan Limited undertook what has been described as the largest underwater scanning project in history, producing a full-scale digital reconstruction of the wreck in its entirety. The project generated more than 16 terabytes of data, over 715,000 still images, and extensive 4K video footage. For the first time, researchers could view the Titanic not as a series of isolated close-up images taken during brief submersible dives, but as a complete, three-dimensional object, a ship broken in two, lying on the bottom of the sea. The level of detail captured in this digital model allows scientists and historians to examine specific areas of the hull, including the sections believed to have been weakened by the pre-departure cold fire, with unprecedented precision. The photographs recovered from the deep-sea camera do not change the facts of what happened. The Titanic struck an iceberg. It sank in 2 hours and 40 minutes. More than 1,500 people died. These facts have been known for over 100 years. What the photographs change is something harder to define. They make it real again. They strip away the distance that a century of retelling has placed between us and the event. When you look at a photograph taken by someone standing on that deck, in those final hours, knowing what that person was looking at and what they were about to face, the statistics dissolve. The numbers become people. The story, which had begun to feel like mythology, becomes something immediate and terrible and true. The Titanic was not sunk by an iceberg alone. It was sunk by overconfidence, by regulatory negligence, by the belief that engineering had made certain kinds of failure impossible. It was sunk by a fire that should have delayed the voyage, by warnings that should have slowed the ship, by lifeboat policies that valued aesthetics over survival. The iceberg was simply the moment when all of those decisions finally collected their debt. The camera on the ocean floor remembered all of it. And now, so must we.